The crossroads outside of redemption. Texas had seen its share of blood and dust, but nobody who ever passed through it could have predicted that it would become the place where two brothers riding under different flags, bearing different loyalties, carrying different wounds, would finally stand face to face and decide the fate of the woman they both, in their own broken ways, had come to protect. The year was 1873, and the land west of San Antonio still smelled like gunpowder and unfinished promises. Celia Shelton had not slept properly in 4 days. She sat in the back of a rattling buckboard wagon, her wrists bound with rope that had rubbed her skin raw, watching the red dust rise behind the wheels in great billowing clouds that looked, she thought, exactly like the smoke from a burning homestead. Her homestead, the one she had built with her father over 7 years of drought and hope and stubborn, relentless labor in the hill country south of Careville. Her father was dead now, 3 days gone, shot in the chest by a man named Hale, who wore a badge he had not earned and carried a ledger full of other people's land claims that he meant to make his own. Hale was the oldest of 2 brothers, and he was the one who had taken everything from her. She did not know yet about the other brother. The wagon belonged to a pair of men in Declan's employ, rough, sullen riders named Amos and Pitt, who had been given instructions to deliver her to a property near Laredo where she would, as Declan had explained to her with a pleasant, practiced smile, sign over the deed to her father's land or spend the rest of her days in a situation she would not enjoy. Celia had not screamed, had not begged, had not cried in front of any of them. She had kept her jaw set and her gray eyes steady, and stored everything she felt inside the quiet iron box she had been building in her chest since she was 12 years old, and her mother had died of fever and her father had looked at her and said, quietly, that they were going to be all right, and that being all right meant not coming apart when the world tried to pull you to pieces. She was 23 years old and she was not coming apart. But she was thinking very hard about the small folding knife she had sewn into the lining of her riding boot 6 months ago, when strange men had first started appearing on the edge of her property, measuring things with surveying equipment, and speaking to each other in low voices they thought she could not hear. The road south was long and punishing, cutting through cedar flats and limestone breaks where the afternoon sun sat on everything like a brand. Celia watched the landscape and counted the miles in her mind and tried to identify landmarks she might use if she got free. A distinctive rock formation shaped like a crouching dog, a dry creek bed lined with pale gray stones, a split-trunk live oak with a cluster of mistletoe thick as a man's torso hanging from its center branches. It was near that live oak that the stranger appeared. He came out of a draw to the east, riding a sorrel horse with a white blaze, moving at an unhurried lope that suggested he was either very confident or very tired. He was tall in the saddle, broad through the shoulders, wearing a duster the color of old clay and a hat that had been through considerable weather. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his shirt, and a jaw that carried several days of dark stubble, and there was something in the way he held himself straight but not stiff, easy but watchful, that made Celia look at him longer than she had intended to. Amos pulled the wagon to a stop without being asked to. The stranger let his horse walk the last 20 yards and halted it broadside to the road, which was a deliberate thing, Celia noted. A deliberate placement that forced anyone wanting to pass to acknowledge him first. "Afternoon," he said. His voice was deep and unhurried, like water running over smooth stone. "Move along, friend," Pitt said from the driver's bench. "We don't need company." The stranger's eyes went past Pitt without hurry, traveled across Amos on the bench beside him, and then settled on Celia in the wagon bed. They were dark eyes, brown, she thought, or possibly a very dark hazel, and they did not look away from her quickly the way most men would have. They stayed and they saw things. "That woman's hands are tied," he said. It was not a question. "Ranch business," Pitt said. "Don't concern yourself." "Somebody make it concern me," Celia said from the wagon bed. Her voice came out clear and steady, and she was deeply grateful for that. The stranger looked at her, and something in his face that had been calm shifted into something considerably less so. "Ma'am," he said, "are you traveling of your own choice?" "I am not," she said. Pitt cursed and reached for the rifle on the bench beside him, and that was a mistake, because in the time it took him to close his hand around it, the stranger had drawn and cocked his sidearm with a movement so economical it was almost quiet. Nobody fired. Nobody moved. The afternoon stood still around them like a painting of itself. "Set the rifle down on the bench and put both your hands where I can see them," the stranger said. He was not shouting. He did not need to. "You too," he said to Amos, who had been very slowly sliding his right hand toward his belt. Amos put both hands in the air. "You know whose employ we're in," Pitt said. There was anger in his voice, but also, underneath it, a beginning of something more cautious. "I don't care much about that right now," the stranger said. He swung down from the sorrel without taking his eyes off the two men, ground-tied the horse with a single practiced drop of the reins, and walked to the back of the wagon. He kept the men in the outer edge of his vision while he looked at Celia directly. "I'm going to cut those ropes," he said to her. "If you'd rather I didn't, tell me now." "I would very much rather you did," she said. He produced a large folding knife from his vest pocket. She noted he had not reached for the boot, and cut through the rope at her wrists with 2 clean strokes. She rubbed the raw skin and felt the blood come back into her hands in a rush of pins and fire. "You armed?" he asked her quietly, close enough now that the question was just for her. "Boot knife," she said, equally quiet. A small thing crossed his face that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "Good woman," he said. Then, louder to the two men, "She's coming with me. You ride back to whoever sent you and tell them that." "You have no idea what you're walking into," Pitt said, his voice low and tight and carrying the weight of something that was more threat than prediction. "I expect I'll find out," the stranger said. He helped Celia down from the wagon. His hand was warm and calloused, and steadied her without gripping her, and walked her to his sorrel. He put her up on the horse first, then swung up behind her without asking her preference, because the situation did not have room for much deliberation. They rode east into the draw he had come from, and Celia listened for the sound of the wagon resuming its southward journey, which it did after a very long pause, and she let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 4 days. "My name is Homer Hale," the stranger said, behind her ear. "I apologize for the proximity, but I'd rather have the horse under one set of reins until we're sure they're not turning back." She registered the name, and she registered the name, and then she registered it again, because her mind was doing something with the syllables that felt important. "Hale," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Declan Hale," she said carefully, "is the man who killed my father and had me put in that wagon." A long pause in which the sorrel moved beneath them and the cedar trees closed around the draw and the afternoon light fell in broken gold pieces through the canopy. "I know who Declan is," Homer said. "He's your kin." "He's my brother," Homer said, "and he has been a source of considerable grief to me for most of my life, but in recent years more than ever." Another pause. "I have not spoken to him in 2 years. I don't plan to change that on his behalf." "What are you doing out here?" she asked. "Looking for him as a matter of fact," he said. "Not to help him, to stop him." He was quiet for a moment. "I had word in San Antonio that he'd gotten himself appointed acting marshal of Kerrville County under false credentials, and that he'd been using the position to seize land from settlers who couldn't mount a legal defense. I didn't know anyone had been killed." Another pause, heavier than the others. "I am sorry about your father, Miss Shelton," she said. "Celia Shelton." He said the name as if he were placing it somewhere careful. "I am sorry, Miss Shelton." She believed him, which surprised her, given everything. They made camp that night on the far side of the draw, in a shallow hollow backed by a limestone overhang, where the fire would not show from more than 20 yards in any direction. Homer was competent about it in a way that spoke of long practice. He had the fire low and the perimeter checked, and a pot of coffee on before Celia had finished washing her wrists with water from his canteen. He gave her a piece of dried beef and a hardtack biscuit from his saddlebag without comment, and she ate both without comment. And they sat across the small fire from each other in the particular silence of two people who have shared a crisis and are still finding the shape of each other at a distance. "How old are you?" she asked him, because she was a direct woman and had always found that asking a thing was more efficient than wondering it. He looked up, a little surprised by the question. 27, he said. "Why?" "I'm trying to figure out what kind of man you are," she said. "Age is one piece." "Is it useful to you?" he asked, with something careful and almost amused in his voice. 27, and riding alone to stop a brother who has federal acquaintances, and a stolen badge tells me either you have a history of not calculating odds, or you believe what you're doing is right enough to outweigh the calculation, she said. "I'm inclined toward the second. But I'd like to know which it is before I decide how much to trust you." He looked at her across the fire for a long moment. The light caught the angles of his face and made them deliberate. "It's the second," he said, "but I won't pretend the first is entirely absent." "That's a more honest answer than most men would give," she said. "I don't see much point in a dishonest one," he said. "Not tonight," Celia decided, quietly and with full awareness of what she was doing to trust him. Not completely. She was not a woman who offered complete trust on the basis of a campfire and a rescue, however genuinely executed, but enough to sleep, which she did, wrapped in the spare blanket he handed her without making a ceremony of it, while he sat up against the limestone and kept his rifle across his knees and let her rest. She woke before dawn to the sound of him moving around the camp, quiet as a man can be when he has learned not to alarm sleeping people. He had coffee ready when she opened her eyes, and he handed her a tin cup without looking at her, which she appreciated, because she was not at her best before coffee and she knew it. "I've been thinking about what to do next," he said, crouching with his own cup and looking into the fire. "Declan will know by now that you got free. He'll be moving." "The land deed," she said. "He needs me to sign it or the claim won't hold. He can't just take the property without a legal instrument." "That's correct," Homer said. He looked at her with what she was beginning to recognize as his default expression, which was a particular quality of attention, not intense in a pressured way, but thorough, as if he was actually registering what was in front of him rather than just seeing the surface of it. "Which means he'll come after you, or send someone, or both." He set his cup down. "I know a man in Kerrville who's a legitimate federal circuit judge. His name is Harlan Graves. I met him 3 years ago on a cattle drive through the Panhandle, and we've kept up a correspondence. If I can get you to him with testimony about what Declan has done, the land seizures, the forged credentials, your father Declan's operation falls apart. The badge goes, the claims get contested, the whole arrangement collapses." Celia turned the cup in her hands. "And my father's land." "I can't promise the land," he said directly. "I would be lying if I did, but I can promise that Declan won't keep it and that there will be a legal record of what happened." "The truth is then," she said. "Not a guarantee, but the truth." "Yes," he said. "I don't make guarantees I can't back up." She looked at him. The dawn was coming through the cedar in long, pale fingers, and in that light he looked tired and earnest and entirely sincere, and she thought about her father, who had also been entirely sincere, and about how much she had loved that quality in a person and how rarely she had encountered it. "All right," she said. "Kerrville." They broke camp as the sun came over the eastern hills, and Celia rode behind Homer on the sorrel because they had no second horse, and she was aware, in a way she catalogued carefully and set aside for later examination, of the warmth of his back, and the way his shoulders moved with the horse, and how she had to hold onto the back of his duster to keep her seat on the descents, and how he had not once made any of that into something uncomfortable. He simply rode, and she simply held on, and the morning opened around them like something beginning. They reached Kerrville by late afternoon of the second day, having stopped the night before in a small ranch belonging to a Mexican family named Fuentes, who gave them supper and a barn to sleep in without asking questions, which Homer had clearly expected because he had gifts in his saddlebag, a twist of tobacco and a spool of thread and a bag of hard candy, that he left on their table before they left in the morning. "You've come through here before," Celia said, as they rode away from the Fuentes ranch. "Several times," he said. "When I rode the range in this country, years ago, Senora Fuentes fed me when I had no money for a meal and didn't mention it afterward." "A person doesn't forget that. What did you do?" she asked. "Before this?" "Range work mostly, sometime with a freight company out of Fort Worth. A year as a deputy in a small town called Moss Creek, which is where I learned that a badge is either a responsibility or a weapon and that some men choose wrong on that." "Moss Creek," she said. "I've heard of it. There was trouble there a few years back." "There was," he said. "I was part of trying to resolve it with varying success." She waited. "The sheriff there was a man named Calder, and he had been taking money from a land company out of Austin to push homesteaders off their claims, and it took 8 months and 3 witnesses to build a case against him. And by the time it was finished, 2 of those witnesses had been frightened into leaving the county, and 1 had died of causes that were officially listed as accidental." He paused. "Calder was removed from office and indicted but never convicted because the circuit court judge had financial dealings with the same land company." Another pause. "I left Moss Creek after that because I did not want to do something I could not take back." Celia absorbed this. "So you know what this is," she said. "I know exactly what this is," he said. "And I know that the way to fight it is through the law, imperfect and infuriating as that law tends to be. Because the other way, the way I was close to choosing in Moss Creek, ends with men dead, and the problem still standing and your own soul considerably darker than when you started." She sat with that for a while, the sorrow moving steadily beneath them, the hill country unrolling around them in waves of cedar and limestone and wildflower. "You're a complicated man," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm a fairly simple man who has had complicated things happen to him," he said. "I'm not sure it's the same thing." She thought it probably was, actually, but she did not say so. Kerrville in 1873 was a town in the process of deciding what it wanted to be. The courthouse was limestone, solid and relatively new, and there were 2 churches and a school and a proper mercantile and a hotel with a painted sign, and there was also a saloon that appeared to have been there considerably longer than any of those other things and showed it. Judge Harlan Graves maintained an office above the mercantile on the main street, and when Homer knocked on the door, a voice from inside said, "It's open," in the tone of a man who has decided that expecting trouble is more efficient than being surprised by it. Judge Graves was a lean man in his 50s with a head of white hair that stood up slightly in front as if he had been thinking very hard, and eyes that were an unusually pale blue and missed nothing. He had his coat off and his sleeves rolled, and he was writing at a desk covered in papers, and he looked up at Homer and then at Celia and then at Homer again. "Homer Hale," he said, "I heard a rumor you were dead." "People seem to find that rumor convenient," Homer said. "Judge Graves, this is Miss Celia Shelton. She has a great deal to tell you, and I believe it needs to be on the record." Graves looked at Celia with that pale, comprehensive gaze. "Sit down, Miss Shelton," he said. "Homer, go find us some coffee. There's a pot on the stove in the back room." Celia sat, and she told Judge Graves everything. Her father, Emmett Shelton, who had held the deed to 460 acres in the hill country south of Kerrville since 1861, the surveyors who had appeared in the spring, the notices that had come from the county marshal's office, Declan Hale's office, claiming unpaid taxes and debts that Emmett Shelton had no record of owing. The confrontation 3 weeks later when Declan had ridden out with 4 men and her father had refused to sign anything, and the argument that had turned into something else, and the shot that had ended her father's life on his own porch, and the 2 days she had spent alone on the property with her father's body while she tried to figure out what to do, and then the arrival of Amos and Pitt. She told it straight, without embellishment, and kept her voice level the whole time, and Judge Graves wrote everything down in a precise hand, and Homer sat in the second chair and listened and occasionally provided a date or a legal reference when Graves asked for one, And by the end of it, the judge sat back and looked at the pages of notes in front of him with an expression that Celia read as grim satisfaction. "I've had 3 other complaints about Declan Hale in the past 4 months," Graves said. "A family named Ortega west of town, a widow woman named Marsh, and an old rancher called Bunting who is nearly 80 and couldn't make the ride to come in himself. None of them had the documentation to go forward. Miss Shelton, do you have the original deed to your father's property? I have it sewn into the lining of my left boot, which is where I put it the morning after my father was killed," she said. There was a brief silence. "Of course you do," Judge Graves said. He looked at Homer over his papers. "Your father ever told you about this woman?" "He hadn't met her yet," Homer said mildly. He did not look at Celia when he said it, and she was glad of that, because she felt her face do something that she was not ready for anyone to see. Graves issued a warrant for Declan Hale's arrest that same evening, which he sent with 2 trusted men toward San Antonio, where Declan was known to maintain additional premises. He also sent word to the Texas Rangers post in Austin, which was a separate and more formal action that would take longer but would, Graves explained, make the case bulletproof against any subsequent legal maneuvering. The question, then, was what to do with Celia while the legal machinery worked. "You can't go back to the property," Homer said, as they stood in the street outside the Mercantile in the cooling early evening. "Not until this is settled. Declan will have men watching it." "I know that," she said. "I'm not an impractical woman." "I know you're not," he said. He was looking at the street, not at her, and there was something in the way he was holding himself, slightly more constrained than usual, that she had begun to recognize as him working something out internally. "There's a boarding house on the east side of town. The woman who runs it is named Mrs. Aldrich, and she's reliable, and Graves uses it for people who need to be somewhere safe while court matters are pending. You'd be safe there." "And you?" she asked. He turned to look at her then, and the evening light was doing things to the planes of his face that she found it difficult not to notice. "I'm going to find Declan," he said. "Homer, not to confront him," he said quickly. "To watch him, to know where he is when Graves's men make the arrest. If he runs, and he's the kind of man who runs, someone needs to know which direction." She looked at him. "You've been planning this separately from Judge Graves," she said. "I've been thinking about it," he said, with a slight pause that answered the question more thoroughly than a direct confirmation would have. "Be careful," she said. She had not intended to say it, and was only moderately embarrassed that she had. It had come out with more weight than she had planned, and he heard the weight in it, she could tell, because something in his face changed in the brief and particular way that things change when words land differently than expected. "I will be," he said. He held her gaze for a moment, and in that moment there was something between them that was not yet a declared thing but was unmistakably real, like the first warmth before a fire fully catches. Then he looked away and the moment released, and he walked her to Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house and introduced her and made sure she was settled, and then he was gone. Mrs. Aldrich was a stout, competent woman of about 50, with a streak of iron gray through her dark hair, and a manner that was brisk without being cold. She gave Celia a room on the 2nd floor with a window that looked east toward the hills, and a basin and a pitcher of water, and a change of clothes that belonged to her niece who was roughly Celia's size, and supper downstairs with 2 other boarders. A land surveyor from Dallas named Whitmore who was in Careville on legitimate business, and was deeply apologetic about his profession given recent events, and a schoolteacher named Miss Dorrance who had come from Missouri the previous fall and was, according to Mrs. Aldrich's brief and comprehensive introduction, the best thing that had happened to the children of this town in 10 years. Celia ate and talked and found, somewhat to her surprise, that she was genuinely glad of the company. The days in the wagon and the days before that on the silent property had been a kind of loneliness she had not quite experienced before, and the simple human noise of other people eating and talking and being present was restorative in a way she could feel physically. She thought about Homer while she ate, which she also catalogued carefully and set aside. He did not return that night or the next. On the third morning, she went to Judge Graves's office and asked if there had been any word, and Graves told her that his men had located Declan Hale in a settlement south of San Antonio called Castroville, and that an arrest had been attempted and that Declan had fled before it was completed. "He's heading north," Graves said. "We think he's heading here." "Here," she said. "He knows you're here," Graves said. He was not unkind about it, but he was direct. "And he knows that you have the deed and that you've given a statement. He's a man who eliminates problems. You'll need to stay close to the boarding house." She thought of Homer, somewhere between here and Castroville, watching a man who was already on the move and heading toward her. "Judge Graves," she said, "Homer Hale was tracking Declan from the south. Does he know that Declan is moving north?" Graves's expression shifted slightly in the way of a man recalculating. "I sent no word to Homer," he said. "I wasn't entirely sure where to find him." "Then he doesn't know," she said. "And if Declan passes him heading north, Homer will be following south while the trouble is coming north." There was a brief pause. "You may be right," Graves said. "I need a horse," she said. "Miss Shelton, I know this land," she said. "I grew up on the southern edge of this country. I know the roads, I know the cuts and the draws, I know which way a man coming from Castroville would ride if he wanted to make time. I can find Homer and tell him which way Declan has turned before Declan reaches Careville." Graves looked at her for a long moment. "You're either very brave or you haven't fully considered what you're proposing," he said. "I've considered it entirely," she said. "Those two things are not mutually exclusive." He gave her the horse. It was a bay mare named Pepper, who was a little short in the back but long on heart, and Celia took her south on the San Antonio road and rode hard for the first hour, and then settled into a steady ground-covering trot. She knew this road. She had ridden it with her father a dozen times, south to San Antonio for supplies and market, and she knew the places where the road ran close to the creek, and the places where it climbed, and the places where a rider could see a long way in any direction. She found Homer at a place called Cypress Crossing, where the road dipped to ford a shallow creek, about 14 miles south of Careville. He was coming north. She pulled Pepper to a halt in the middle of the road, and he pulled his sorrel up 10 yards from her, and they looked at each other in the bright noon light for a moment that felt longer than it was. "He turned," Homer said. "He's heading north," she said at the same moment. They both stopped. "Graves sent you?" Homer asked. "Graves gave me a horse," she said. "I made the argument." He looked at her with that particular attention of his, and then he said, "He's not just heading north. He's heading here specifically. I found one of his riders 2 hours ago, a young man named Wick who had just had enough and wanted out. Wick told me Declan has sent word ahead to 2 men in Careville. Doesn't know their names, but he said Declan is planning to get to you before Graves can make the arrest official, because without your testimony the record is substantially thinner." Celia felt the cold run down her spine and did not show it. "Then we need to be in front of him." "We need to be smart in front of him," Homer said. "Declan is not a stupid man. He was the better shot growing up, and he has at least 4 riders with him, and he knows this country almost as well as you do." He paused. "Almost? There's a crossroads," she said, 4 miles north of here, where the San Antonio road meets the old Medina Trace. It's the only place between here and Careville where a man coming from the south has to commit to one direction or the other. If we're at that crossroads before he is, and if Graves sends men to meet us there, we end this with the law rather than with guns." Homer looked at her. "You know the crossroads. I was born near it," she said. "Can you get word to Graves faster than I can ride to meet him?" "I know a boy named Tomas Fuentes, the son of the family we stayed with, who rides between here and Careville 3 times a week. He keeps a horse at a pen a mile east of here. If he's there today, he can have Graves at that crossroads within 2 hours." Homer was quiet for a single breath. "Go," he said. "I'll hold the crossroads." "Alone," she said. "Until Graves arrives," he said. "I've been in worse positions." "That is not reassuring," she said. Something crossed his face then that was not quite a smile and not quite something else, and occupied the space between them in a way she felt. "Celia," he said, It was the first time he had used her given name without the miss in front of it, and the way he said it was not casual, was not an accident. "I will be at that crossroads when you and Graves get there. That is a thing I can promise you." She held his gaze. "Then I'll hold you to it," she said. She rode east. Tomas Fuentes was at the horse pen, which was the first genuinely lucky thing that had happened in the past week, and he was 17 and capable, and took the message, and the coin Homer had given Celia with equal seriousness, and was mounted and heading north before she had finished explaining everything. Celia turned Pepper back toward the crossroads and rode. The crossroads sat in a flat stretch of land where the cedar thinned out, and you could see a long way in every direction. There was a large twisted mesquite on the north corner, and a pile of limestone rocks on the south that local people had been adding to for years, until it was head high on a standing man, and 4 roads ran away from it like spokes from a wheel. Celia came in from the east, and saw the sorrel tied to the mesquite and Homer standing at the top of the limestone pile with his rifle looking south. She rode up and he turned, and for a moment he simply looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, which was relief, pure and unguarded, the kind of expression that a person makes before they have time to arrange something more controlled over the top of it. "Tomas is on his way," she said. 2 hours, maybe less." "Good," he said. He stepped down from the limestone and held Pepper's bridle while Celia dismounted. "I can see about a mile south down the San Antonio road. No riders yet." "Will he stop at the crossroads?" she asked. "Or go around it?" "He'll stop," Homer said. "Declan doesn't know we've anticipated him. He thinks he's heading to Careville undetected to deal with things quietly. He won't be hurrying. He'll want to approach the town at night." "Then we have time," she said. "Some," he agreed. They stood together at the crossroads in the early afternoon, the sky enormous and blue above them and the land flat and honest all around, and Celia was aware of the particularity of the moment. 2 people who had been thrown together by disaster, standing in a place that felt symbolic in the way that certain physical intersections do, as if the geography itself was participating in the thing being decided. "Tell me about your father," Homer said, unexpectedly. He was not looking at her, he was looking south down the road. "What was he like?" She was quiet for a moment. "He was a builder," she said. "Not just of physical things, though he was that too. He built structures of understanding, I suppose. He could take a situation that seemed incomprehensible and find the shape of it, the way it made sense, and then explain that shape to you until you could see it too. He was patient about it, never made you feel stupid for not having seen it yourself." Homer nodded slowly. "He taught you to ride," he said. "It was not quite a question." "He taught me everything practical," she said. "My mother died when I was 12. After that it was just the 2 of us on the property, and there wasn't any point in dividing what needed to be done by what was supposed to belong to which of us. We both did all of it." "That must have been a partnership," Homer said. "It was," she said, and her voice did a thing she had not asked it to, which was to carry more than the words. She stopped and breathed and steadied. Homer turned to look at her then, and whatever he saw in her face, he did not look away from it or offer the quick social palliation that people sometimes offered when they saw grief and did not know what to do with it. He simply looked at her and was present, and that quality of being simply and fully present was the thing she had been noticing about him since the first moment, and she felt it now as something more than observed. She felt it as given. "He sounds like a man worth mourning," Homer said. "He is," she said. "He was," she paused. "He would have liked you." Homer looked at her, and in his look there was something that she recognized finally for what it was. She had been recognizing it for days, she supposed, in increments, and now it was fully assembled and visible, and she held it in her gaze and let him hold hers. "I would have been glad of that," he said. Before either of them could say anything further, and Celia suspected, from the quality of the silence that followed, that there had been further things available to be said, Homer's gaze went south, and his expression shifted back into its watchful configuration. "Riders," he said. "4, coming slow." Celia turned. She could see the dust before she could see the men, and then the men resolved out of the dust 4 riders moving in a loose group, not hurrying, and at the front of the group, a man who was taller in the saddle than the others and rode with a particular quality of ownership, as if the land he was crossing was already his. "That's Declan," Homer said. His voice was flat and careful. Celia looked at Declan Hale for the first time clearly in daylight. She had seen him twice before, briefly, at her property, but always at a distance or in the confusion of the confrontation. And she saw the family resemblance immediately, which was strange and unsettling. He had Homer's height and something of Homer's coloring, but where Homer's face was open, Declan's was closed, set in lines of habitual calculation. He was perhaps 30, good-looking in the way that a knife is good-looking, all function, no warmth. Homer stepped forward into the center of the crossroads. Declan pulled up when he was 20 yards out and his men halted with him. There was a silence that was long enough to have its own weight. "Homer," Declan said. "Declan," Homer said. Well, Declan looked at Celia and his face did something unpleasant. "She had help." "She did," Homer said. "And Judge Graves has a warrant for your arrest and his men will be at this crossroads within the next 2 hours. The better choice here is to let this end the quiet way." "You're going to tell me about better choices," Declan said. His voice was pleasant. That was the thing about Declan's voice, Celia noted. It maintained its pleasantness as a kind of mask, and the mask was not supposed to slip, but underneath it she could feel the cold. "I'm going to tell you that it's over," Homer said. "The deed is with Graves. The testimony is on record. 3 other families have come forward. Whatever you've built out of this is gone." "And you think that matters to me?" Declan said. "I think you're a practical man," Homer said. "And I think you're calculating right now whether you can put bullets in both of us and ride hard enough and far enough to make this go away. And I want you to be sure that the calculation doesn't work, because Graves has already sent the record to Austin." Declan looked at him. The riders behind him were very still. "You've always been sanctimonious," Declan said. "You know what, Homer? That was always the problem with you." "Maybe so," Homer said. He had not moved and had not reached for his gun and was standing in the center of the crossroads with his hands at his sides, looking at his brother with an expression that was not anger and was not grief, and was something more complicated than either. "But I was never the one who shot an old man on his own porch." Declan's jaw tightened. And then, from the north, came the sound of riders, multiple horses moving at pace. And in that sound was the particular rhythm of organized and purposeful movement, which Declan heard and recognized as clearly as everyone else at the crossroads heard and recognized it. The calculation changed. One of Declan's riders, the one on his far left, turned his horse and rode southeast and was gone between one breath and the next. A second rider looked at Declan for instruction and received none and walked his horse sideways out of the group. Declan sat very still. Judge Graves arrived at the crossroads with 5 men, and the legal machinery that had been grinding toward this moment for months arrived with them. There were warrants and there were rifles and there was the simple arithmetic of outnumbering, and Declan Hale, who was practical when it counted, made the calculation and dismounted. He did not look at Homer when they put the irons on him. He looked at Celia. "That land won't come back to you," he said, "not in any arrangement that matters." "That's not what she came for," Homer said from behind Celia. "What did she come for then?" Declan said. "For you to stop," Homer said. "That's what she came for." Declan was taken north toward Careville, and his remaining 2 riders were taken with him. And Judge Graves paused at the crossroads to take Homer's hand and Celia's hand in turn, and say that what they had done was not a small thing, and that he would see it through personally, and that he was sorry about her father. And then it was just Homer and Celia at the crossroads, with the horses and the afternoon light and the enormous quiet that follows the end of a large and dangerous thing. "It's over," she said. "The immediate part," he said. "There will be more trials," he said, "probably 2 or 3, testimony again. Legal challenges to the land claims, months of it probably." He paused. "Judge Graves will need you available." She looked at him. Available, she said. Nearby, he amended. Then, after a pause, Careville ideally. She understood what he was navigating toward, and she had been navigating in the same direction without announcing it, and the fact that they were both doing it without quite saying so was simultaneously sensible, and, she decided, mildly insufficient for a woman who had just ridden 14 miles alone and stood at a crossroads between an armed man and his arresting officers. Homer, she said. Yes. Tell me plainly what you mean. He turned to face her fully. The afternoon was going to gold around them, and the mesquite threw a long shadow across the limestone pile, and the crossroads roads ran away in all four directions, and it was exactly the kind of moment, she thought, that would look like the beginning of something if you were watching it from outside. I mean, he said, that I would like you to stay in Careville. I mean that I would like to be here too. I mean that I am not sure what I've been doing with my life for the past 7 years, but I know what it felt like to find you in that wagon and to sit across a fire from you that first night, and to hear you talk about your father, and to stand here with you at this crossroads. It felt like it mattered, in a way that most of the things I've done have not felt like they mattered. He stopped. Then, and I know we've known each other a very short time, and I know you've been through a terrible thing and are still in the middle of it, and I am not asking you to feel anything specific or to promise anything. I would like you to know where I stand. She looked at him for a long moment. The gold light was full on his face, and his dark eyes were steady and earnest and entirely undefended, which was a kind of courage she had not often seen. I know where you stand, she said. I've known for a little while. A pause. I stand nearby, he breathed. And then, slowly and carefully and with the seriousness of a man who understood the gravity of the gesture, he reached out and took her hand. She let him. They stood at the crossroads and held on, and the sun went further west, and the land was golden and quiet around them. The months that followed were exactly as Homer had predicted, and also more than he had predicted. The trials, there were eventually 3, as he had said, stretched across the fall of 1873 and into the winter. Celia gave testimony twice before 2 different judges, once in Careville and once in San Antonio, and both times she delivered it with the same level precision she had brought to every other thing in her life, and both times she could find Homer in the courtroom, always in a position where she could see him without having to look for him, which she appreciated without fully articulating why. Declan Hale was convicted on charges of unlawful seizure, fraud in the obtaining of official credentials, and the killing of Celia Shelton, which was tried as murder in the 2nd degree. The sentences were consecutive and substantial. He would not be a free man for a very long time, and the property claims he had engineered were systematically overturned, beginning with the Shelton land claim and proceeding through the Ortega family, the widow Marsh, and old rancher Bunting, who rode into court himself to hear the verdict despite his 80 years. Celia's land was returned to her on a bright December morning, and Judge Graves handed her the deed across his desk with the quiet formality appropriate to the moment, and she took it in both hands and held it the way you hold something that you almost lost and are still slightly amazed to be holding again. Homer was there. He had been there for most of the important moments by then, which had happened in a gradual and entirely natural way, as if his presence at the significant junctures of her days was simply the arrangement of things, and she had stopped finding it surprising and started finding it necessary, which was a distinction she recognized clearly. They had spent the fall getting to know each other in the methodical and thorough way of 2 people who have already decided that the knowing matters and are going about it carefully. Long conversations on the porch of Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house after supper, while the Texas evening cooled around them and the stars came out above the hills. Rides through the hill country on Sunday mornings, when Homer would borrow a horse from the livery, and they would go out into the land she knew, and she would show him the particular beauties of the limestone and the cedar, and the way the light worked in early morning on the flat rock faces of the creek bluffs. Shared meals and shared silences and the slow accumulation of knowing. What made her laugh, which was more things than people expected, and what made him quiet, which was the particular kind of injustice that had no remedy, and what she thought about at night, which she told him in pieces, and he received as if each piece was something he intended to take very good care of. He had found work in Careville, helping Graves's office with investigations similar to the Declan Hale matter. There were more of them, that winter and the following spring, as the same patterns of land fraud and forged documentation seemed to be operating across the hill country region, and Homer's combination of legal knowledge, practical experience, and local familiarity made him genuinely useful. It was not glamorous work, and it was not highly paid, but it was work that mattered, and Celia had noticed that this was the category of work that Homer moved toward with the consistency of a compass pointing north. She had moved back to the Shelton property in January, after the deed was returned, because she was not a woman who could live in a boarding house while her land was empty and her father's house needed winter tending. The ride back to the property with the deed folded in her coat pocket had been one of the most private moments of her life, standing on the porch her father had built, looking out at the cedar and the sky, feeling the weight of the land as both a burden and a benediction. She had spoken to him, there on the porch, in the way that people speak to the dead when they are sure they are not being observed, and she had told him that she had held on, and that the land was still theirs, and that she had met someone she thought he would have approved of. She was in the kitchen 3 weeks later, in early February, when Homer arrived. He had ridden out from Careville 20 miles, which was not a casual ride, and he stood in the doorway of the kitchen holding his hat in both hands with the expression of a man who has organized his thoughts very carefully during a long ride and is now delivering them. "I have been thinking," he said. "That seems to be a fairly constant activity for you," she said. She did not look up from the bread she was kneading, because she had learned that some conversations were better when neither person was staring directly at the other. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask it." "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "And I want to be clear that I am asking because I love you, which is a thing I have been aware of for some time now and have been working up to saying plainly. I love that you are brave and direct, and that you feed people at your table without making a ceremony of it. I love that you talk to your horse as if she has opinions worth considering, and that you keep a folding knife in your boot, and that you rode 14 miles alone to a crossroads on the strength of your own knowledge of this country. I love how you talked about your father and how you testified twice in that courthouse without once looking like you were afraid, even though I know you were, because I was watching your hands." He paused. "I would like to spend the rest of my life in the company of this property and of you, if you'll have me, and I promise to be useful to both." Celia stopped kneading. She looked at her hands on the dough, and she thought about the past 8 months, and she thought about Homer Hale standing at a crossroads in the afternoon sun with his hands at his sides and his voice perfectly even, and she thought about her father, who had said that being all right meant not coming apart, and who had also said once, when she was 16, and had asked him about her mother, that the best thing in life was finding the person whose presence made the hard parts not just bearable but worth it. She looked up. "Yes," she said. He breathed. "Yes," she said again, because it was a word that felt good to say twice. He crossed the kitchen and she turned from the table, and he took her face in his hands, which were warm and careful, and kissed her for the first time. And it was the kind of kiss that is also a declaration, the kind that closes something and opens something at the same time, and she put her floury hands against his chest and felt his heart, which was going considerably faster than his voice ever suggested it was. And she thought that this was perhaps the most accurate information she had ever received about a person. They were married in Careville in April of 1874. On a day that the hill country produces every spring as a kind of apology for the heat that is coming. All blue sky and wildflower, and the air so clear you could see the far hills in exact detail. Judge Graves performed the ceremony, which he was qualified to do, in the yard of the Kerrville courthouse, and Mrs. Aldrich cried, and Miss Dorrance the schoolteacher threw flower petals, and Senora Fuentes attended with her husband and her son Tomas, who stood very straight and looked proud of himself in the way of a young man who knows he played a part in something that came out well. There was a small celebration afterward at the hotel, and dancing in the street, which Kerrville did for almost any occasion that justified it. And Homer danced with Celia with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, which meant she had his full focus for the full length of every song, and she had never been so aware of being seen as she was in those hours. When they rode back to the Shelton property that evening, the property that was now the Hale property, though she kept Shelton as part of her name the way she kept the deed, as a thing that honored a history. The hills were purple in the last light, and the first stars were showing, and Homer rode beside her on a roan horse he had purchased in November, and they were quiet together in the way of people who have run out of the need for words as a provisional substitute and can simply be. "Are you happy?" he asked her, as they came over the last rise and the house came into view below them. She looked at the house, her father's house, which she had been slowly adding to through the winter, a second room on the east side where there was more morning light, and she looked at the land around it, and she looked at Homer beside her. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "Considerably," he said. "The years built themselves after that the way years do when the people inside them are paying attention and doing the work." Homer took a formal position with the Federal Circuit Court out of Austin, which meant travel sometimes, but Celia had grown up on a working land and had never required constant company, and she spent the days he was gone in the vigorous and productive occupation of the property, which she was expanding carefully. New fields, a second cistern, a chicken house that she built herself in the spring of 1875 and was inordinately proud of. She also made sure the Ortega family, whose land claim had been restored after Declan's conviction, had help with their spring planting that first year, because they had lost so much time on their own property while fighting the legal battle that they were behind. She organized it practically and without fuss. She simply showed up with seed and a hand plow and stayed until the work was done. The Ortegas never forgot it. The widow Marsh, whose property was east of Kerrville, became something approaching a close friend, which surprised Celia and pleased her. She had not had many women friends. Her years on the remote property with her father had not provided much opportunity, and Eleanor Marsh turned out to be exactly the kind of person she got along with best, which was to say direct, capable, and disinclined to waste time on either self-pity or pretense. Homer came home from each trip to Austin with new cases and old stories, and the air of a man who is tired but satisfied, and they would sit on the porch she had extended along the south side of the house in the evenings, and he would tell her about the cases, and she would tell him about the property, and they would both end up talking about larger things. The way the land was changing, the people coming west in greater numbers, the ongoing tension between settlement and what had been here before, which Homer thought about with a complexity that she had come to expect from him and which she shared. The injustices of the period were not abstract to either of them. The Ortega family had faced challenges that went beyond Declan Hale's machinations, challenges rooted in the broader pattern of Spanish land grants being contested and undermined by Anglo settlers and their legal representatives, a pattern that the courts were sometimes willing to address and sometimes were not. Homer spent 2 months in 1876 building a case for a family named Vasquez, whose 300-acre grant was being challenged by a railroad company with deep pockets and deeper connections to the state legislature. And the case took everything he had and ended in a partial victory that was better than what most families in that position received, but not as good as what was just. He came home from that one quieter than usual, and she let him be quiet until he wasn't, and then they talked about it, and he said what he always eventually said, which was that the law was a flawed instrument in a flawed world, but it was the instrument they had, and the only alternative was giving the flawed world to the people who had no interest in making it less so. She agreed with him. She also thought, privately, that his 27-year-old self at that first campfire had already known this, and had simply been growing into it more fully ever since. Their son, James Emmett Hale, was born in September of 1875, in the house that had been Emmett Shelton's, in the bedroom where the morning light came in from the east. He arrived in the early hours before dawn with a vigor and immediacy that the midwife, a Careville woman named Dora, described as a child with opinions about timing, and Homer, who had been present in the kitchen throughout with a complete inability to sit down, came to the door when Dora called him and looked at Celia holding their son with an expression that she had never seen on anyone's face before, and immediately recognized as the thing all other expressions of feeling were smaller versions of. "Hello," Homer said to the baby, in a voice completely unlike his usual voice. The baby looked at him with the unfocused and serious attention of newborns, which is the attention of a being that has not yet learned to sort experience into categories. "He has your eyes," Celia said. "I hope he has your nerve," Homer said. She laughed, which she had not expected to do at that particular moment, and the laugh turned into something rower, and she pressed her face to the top of her son's head and breathed him in, and Homer sat on the edge of the bed beside her and put his arm around her, and they stayed that way while the sky outside went from black to gray to rose, and it was the best morning Celia had ever known. They named him James for Homer's grandfather, whose name was one of the few things about his family's past that Homer held with affection, and Emmett for her father, and the combination felt right in the way that a well-fitted door feels right flush on all sides, nothing catching, a good honest closure. Little James was a serious child and a curious one, with his mother's gray eyes and his father's inclination toward watching things before joining in, and he walked at 10 months and talked in full sentences by 15 months, which Dora the midwife said was extraordinary, but which Celia felt was simply consistent with the character he had shown from the beginning. Homer was as present a father as his work allowed, and when he was away he wrote letters, actual letters, 2 or 3 pages in his precise, unhurried hand, describing where he was and what he was seeing and asking questions about the property and James, and whatever she was building or planting or fixing. She wrote back with equal thoroughness, and the correspondence from those years, which she kept in a cedar box on the shelf above the bedroom window, formed a record of the life they were building that was as complete and honest as any account she knew. The second child, a girl they named Anna, came in the summer of 1877, arriving in considerably more of a hurry than her brother had, and causing Homer to miss the actual event by approximately 3 minutes, because he had been walking the perimeter of the south field with James on his shoulders when Dora sent Tomas Fuentes's younger brother to find him, and he arrived at a dead run to find Celia already holding the baby and looking, in his words afterward, entirely self-possessed and mildly amused. "You could have waited another 5 minutes," he told her, not quite catching his breath. "She had opinions about timing," Celia said. "Just like her brother," Homer said. "Just like her father," Celia said. He kissed her forehead and then the baby's forehead and then sat down heavily in the chair beside the bed with the expression of a man experiencing relief at a volume he had not anticipated, and James stood in the doorway looking at the baby with the grave attention of a 2-year-old encountering a new category of thing. "Is that a person?" James asked. "She is," Homer said. "She's small," James said. "You were 2, Celia said. "You'll get used to each other." James considered this with his characteristic seriousness. "All right," he said, with the tone of a negotiator accepting terms. Anna was 3 months old when Homer came home from Austin with news about Declan. He told her in the evening after the children were asleep, on the porch with the night breeze moving through the cedar and the stars full overhead, and he told it straight, the way he always told difficult things. Declan had died in prison, not of violence, as she might have imagined, but of pneumonia, which the prison physician had not addressed with sufficient speed. He had been 43 years old. He had died without having spoken to Homer. "I'm sorry," she said. Homer looked at the stars. "For which part?" he asked, not unkindly. "For the whole of it," she said. "That he was what he was. That he did what he did. That there wasn't a resolution that meant anything." "No," he said. "There wasn't." He was quiet. "I used to think there might be. That if I found him and if the law dealt with him, that there would be something on the other side of it that felt like closure. But it's not like a door closing. It's more like," he paused, "like a road you were on that just ends, and you're standing where it ends and the land is still there on all sides." She moved her chair closer to his and put her hand over his where it rested on his knee. "This land is still there," she said. He turned his hand under hers and held on. "Yes," he said, "it is." The years continued to build themselves, and each one had its own particular character. The drought of 1879, which was brutal and prolonged and cost them 2 fields and most of their small cattle herd, required the same stripped-down focus that difficult things always required of Celia. And Homer came home from a long federal case in Austin to find her in the south field in the dust and heat trying to save the last of the winter wheat, with an ingenuity of water management that he said afterward was remarkable. "You could have told me," he said, not reproachfully. "You were working on a land fraud case that affected 11 families," she said. "I was managing a drought that affected 2 fields. You are one of those 11 families in terms of importance to me," he said. "I know that," she said, "which is also why I handled it." He looked at her with that particular look, the one she had been accumulating for 6 years now and still felt each time. "How did I find you?" he said. "At a crossroads," she said. "At the right crossroads," he said. "Well," she said, "you chose to stop." The drought broke in the fall, as droughts do, and the fields came back in the spring of 1880 with a richness that felt like restitution. They planted more than they had before, extending into the northern quarter of the property that had been lying fallow, and hired 2 hands, a young Mexican man named Raul, who had come north from Laredo looking for work, and an older rancher named Perkins who had lost his own property in the drought and needed a place to put his considerable skills. Both stayed. Raul eventually bought a piece of land adjacent to theirs with wages he had carefully saved, and the help of a small loan from Homer, and the 2 properties operated as a practical partnership for years afterward. Perkins, who had no family and no particular place to be, simply became part of the Hale household in the gradual, organic way of people who fit and are needed. James started school in Careville in the fall of 1881, riding in 3 days a week on a small brown pony that Homer had selected with James's considerable input. And Miss Dorrance, still the schoolteacher, now married to the surveyor Whitmore and considerably softened by happiness, wrote Celia a note at the end of the first month to say that James was exceptional in his reasoning and should be encouraged in it. Celia showed the note to Homer over supper, and he read it and set it down and looked at it and said, "I know he is. But it's good to have it confirmed." Anna, who was 4 and already at the stage of having strong opinions about everything including the contents of her own plate, looked at the note with the interest of someone who intended to understand its significance. "What does it say about me?" she asked. "You haven't started school yet," James told her with brotherly precision. "I know everything already," Anna said. "You really do think that," Homer said admiringly. "She comes by it honestly," Celia said, looking at Homer. "I think it comes from your side," he said. "Your side," she said. They looked at each other across the table with the children between them and the lamp lit against the Texas evening and the good smell of food and family. And it was the kind of ordinary moment that is also, somehow, the shape of the entire life. Not a summit, not a resolution, but the simple daily fact of it, which was better than either. In 1882, Homer's work with the federal circuit took him into a larger investigation, a coordinated land fraud operation that stretched across 4 counties, and involved a group of lawyers from Austin and a sympathetic state legislator. And the case took the better part of a year and required him to testify before a federal grand jury in Austin in the spring of 1883. It was the kind of case that made enemies, and he was careful about it, and Celia was careful about it in her own way, which was to make sure the property was managed and secure, and that the children's lives were as undisturbed as she could make them. When he came home after the grand jury, later than he had said and considerably more tired, she was on the porch with a lamp and a cup of coffee, waiting. He rode up and she met him at the gate, and he dismounted and they stood in the dark, and she held the lamp up to see his face, which told her everything she needed to know. "It went well," she said. "It went," he said, "well enough." He put his arms around her there at the gate, and she let the lamp hang at her side so her other arm could go around him, and they stood together for a long moment in the dark while the horse waited patiently. "The children are asleep," she said. "I'll see them in the morning," he said. He rested his chin on the top of her head. "I missed this," he said, "all of it. You, the property, James being serious about everything, Anna arguing with gravity itself." She laughed softly. "She told Perkins yesterday that his method of repairing the fence post was suboptimal." "She's 6, Homer said. "She said suboptimal," Celia said. He laughed, a real one, the kind that came from deep, and she felt it against her and felt glad of it, which was a feeling she had felt so many times in their years together that it had long since ceased to surprise her and had simply become one of the reliable foundations of her daily life. He was home for the summer, and the summer was a long and golden one, the kind that the hill country produces every several years as a reminder of what the land is capable of. The children grew. James turned 8 and developed a passionate interest in the mechanics of water management, which he had derived partly from watching his mother during the drought years and partly from a natural inclination toward systems that made sense. He spent weeks that summer engineering small irrigation channels in the South Field with Raoul's patient assistance, and the results were, objectively, quite good. Anna turned 6 and started school, and confirmed Miss Dorrance's expectations by being brilliant, argumentative, and fundamentally kind in a combination that the teacher said in her note to Celia was exhausting in the best possible way. Homer took James hunting twice in September, not for the killing of things, which James was not particularly interested in, but for the tracking and the reading of sign, which the boy absorbed with an intensity that Homer found both gratifying and slightly alarming. "He already knows more about tracking deer through cedar brush than most men twice his age," Homer said. "He's thorough," Celia said. "He is. He's going to do something significant." "He might just be a very good rancher," she said, without any implication that this would be a lesser thing. "He might," Homer said. "He'll make whatever he is into something real." Celia thought of her father when he said that, the way she sometimes did when something good happened, because she had been carrying on a long and private conversation with Emmett Shelton's memory for 10 years now, and the conversation had taken many forms but was always fundamentally about whether she was doing it right. Whether she was being the thing he had raised her to be. Whether the life she was building was the one that made the holding on worth it. She thought, standing in the kitchen of the house she had expanded 3 times now, watching Homer and James come up from the South Field together in the late afternoon light with their heads bent in the particular configuration of 2 people engaged in a serious and equal conversation, that the answer was yes. It was more than yes, in fact. It was something she had not had a word for until recently, and the word she had settled on was abundance, which was not about the land or the cattle or the number of rooms in the house, but about the quality of the life inside those things, the fullness of it, the realness of it, the way it was built of days that mattered. The 3rd child, another son, arrived in January of 1884 and was named Thomas after no one in particular, but because both of them simply liked the sound of it, and the way it fit alongside James and Anna. Thomas was, from the beginning, the most straightforwardly cheerful of the three children, a round, smiling baby who grew into a round, smiling toddler who seemed to approach the world with a fundamental confidence that Celia associated not with naivety, but with a particular kind of constitutional contentment. "He didn't get that from either of us," Homer said, when Thomas was about 18 months and had laughed for 20 minutes at a grasshopper doing nothing in particular in the yard. "Your grandfather was apparently very cheerful," Celia said. "According to you." "He was," Homer said. He watched Thomas with the expression he wore for all three of them, which was a form of gratitude so complete it had no margin for anything else. "I think I got some of it. You do have a capacity for contentment that I find remarkable in a man who has spent his career documenting what people do to each other," she said. "That's because I separate it," he said. "The work is the work and the life is the life and the life is very—" He stopped. "Very what?" she asked. "Very good," he said. He looked at her. "You know that." "I do," she said. "I wanted to hear you say it." He put down the coffee cup he was holding and crossed the kitchen and kissed her, thoroughly and without hurry, the way he had always kissed her, as if he had full time for it regardless of what else was waiting. Thomas laughed at the grasshopper. James came home from school one evening in the fall of 1884 and reported, with the even tone he used for information of all levels of importance, that there was a boy in his class named Will Crawford who had been telling the other children that the Ortega family's land was not rightfully theirs, and that his father had said so. James had responded, apparently with some thoroughness, by presenting the legal history of the Ortega claim and the terms of the restored deed, and Will Crawford had been unpersuaded, and the two of them had disagreed publicly, and Miss Dorrance had addressed the class on the subject of documented historical fact. Homer listened to this recounting with his full attention. "Was Will Crawford unkind to the Ortega children?" he asked. "He said things that were unkind," James said. "I think he believed what he said, though. He wasn't performing it." "That's an important distinction," Homer said. "That's what I thought," James said. "A person who believes a wrong thing might be corrected. A person performing a wrong thing is doing something different." Celia looked at her son. He was 9 years old. "Your grandfather would have liked you enormously," she said. James looked at her. He had been hearing about Emmett Shelton his entire life, in the way that his mother told him, not as a sad story but as a living one, as if Emmett were simply in another room and capable of having opinions about things. "Do you think he would have agreed with how I handled it?" James asked. "I think he would have said you were right, that the truth matters, and right that unkindness and wrongness are different problems requiring different responses," Celia said. "And I think he would have told you that you'll meet people who mix the two together for the rest of your life, and that the skill is in keeping them separate." James nodded seriously. "I'll remember that," he said. The years continued, as years do, and the life they had built continued to be the thing it had become, large and real and full of the specific details that make a life distinct. The expanding house, the growing fields, the children becoming themselves in all their different directions. Homer's work, which continued to matter and to cost him something and to be worth what it cost. Celia's land, which she worked with the same relentless and affectionate attention she had given it since she was old enough to be useful. They saw Judge Graves every few months, either in town or on circuit, and the judge remained one of the fixed points of their life in the way that certain people become fixed points, reliable, specific, and associated with the things that matter. He retired from the bench in 1886 and moved into a smaller house in Careville, and could be found most evenings on his porch with a glass of bourbon and an opinion about whatever was in that week's newspaper. And Homer still went to him for counsel when the work was difficult, and Graves gave it freely and well. Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house continued to operate as a place of safety for women and families in difficult legal situations, and Celia contributed to its operation with money and with occasional presence. She was, by the mid-1880s, one of the women in the hill country that other women came to when things had gone wrong. because her reputation was the reputation of a woman who had been in that place and had come out of it, and could be trusted to know the difference between what helped and what merely looked like it. The Fuentes family prospered, and Tomas married a woman from Castroville named Maria, and they had 4 children and ran a successful freighting operation between Careville and San Antonio. And the connection between their family and the Hale family continued with the easy warmth of people who had been present at each other's critical moments and had no need to perform the friendship because it was simply real. Eleanor Marsh, the widow, married old Bunting's son in 1879, which nobody had predicted including them, and the 2 properties together made a substantial and well-managed ranch, and Eleanor remained Celia's closest friend for the rest of their lives, which was saying something about longevity. On an October evening in 1887, Homer and Celia sat on the south porch of the house after the children were in bed, James 12, Anna 10, Thomas 3, and requiring considerably more energy than his 2-year-old self had, and the evening was cool in the particular way of hill country fall, and the stars were doing what they always did over Texas, which was to be implausibly numerous. Homer had been in Austin for 3 weeks on a complex case involving the Mexican land grant situation that had been deepening in complexity across the region, and he had come home 2 days ago, and they had been in the process of returning to their particular daily equilibrium, which took a day or 2 after his longer absences, not because anything was strained, but because the full sense of each other required proximity to properly calibrate. He had his coffee and she had hers, and the night was around them. "Do you ever think about that first Crossroads?" he asked. She turned to look at him. "Which one?" "The one on the San Antonio road, where we waited for Declan." "Yes," she said. Sometimes a pause. "What made you think of it?" "I drove past it on the way back from Austin," he said. "The Medina Trace is barely a road now. The main route has shifted west, but the mesquite is still there, and the limestone pile, it's bigger actually. Someone has been adding to it." "Someone is always adding to it," she said. "They have been for years." "I stopped for a minute," he said. "It felt like a thing I had to acknowledge." He was quiet. "I was thinking about what it meant that we were both there that day. You coming from the east with a message, me coming from the south with information we needed to share. Both of us arriving at the same point in time." "We planned it," she said. "It wasn't accidental. We planned to be at the same place," he said. "We didn't plan the rest of it." He looked at her. "We didn't plan this." She looked back at him. "No," she said. "We didn't." He reached over and took her hand, which was the gesture he had made 1,000 times and which had not become habitual in the sense of being automatic. It remained, every time, a deliberate and specific thing, a small restatement of the choice they had both made. "I'm glad I stopped that day," he said, "when I saw that wagon." "You could not have stopped," she said. "It's not in your character." "Maybe not," he said, "but I'm glad the person in the wagon was you." She looked at him in the October night, this man who had found her at a crossroads and stood between her and his own blood, and held her hand on a limestone rock in the afternoon, and promised her a truth instead of a guarantee, and kept that promise for every year since. "So am I," she said. The stars went on above them, and the land lay quiet, and the house behind them held their children and their life, and the accumulation of every day they had chosen to live it the way they had lived it, which was with the kind of honesty and attention that makes a life into something worth calling one. In the spring of 1888, they expanded the south field for the last time, taking it all the way to the creek, which meant fencing 300 yards of new boundary and digging post holes in limestone, which was exactly as difficult as it sounds. Homer did the work alongside Raoul and Perkins, and James helped after school and on weekends, and Celia brought them lunch every day, and occasionally a tool they had failed to bring, and occasionally a correction to their fence line when the string had drifted. "The string has drifted," she said on the 3rd day. "I know," Homer said. He was sweating and had limestone dust on his hat. "You want help resetting it?" "I would be glad of the help," he said. She reset the string and they looked at it together. "There," she said. "There," he agreed. He kissed her temple, gritty with dust, and went back to the post hole. Anna, who was riding home from school and had witnessed this exchange, looked at her brother James, who was riding beside her. "Are they always like this?" she said. "Always," James said, with the satisfaction of someone reporting a reliable thing. Anna considered this. "Good," she said. The deed to the Shelton property, the Hale property, hung in the main room of the house, framed in cedar that Homer had cut himself from a fallen tree on the north side of the property. And below it, on the same wall, was a small photograph taken in Careville on their 5th anniversary, in 1879, at a photographer's studio that had opened that year, and was much patronized by families wanting a record of themselves. In the photograph, Homer and Celia stood side by side with James between them, Anna not yet born, and the quality of the image was such that you could see the expression on their faces clearly. Homer, with his particular quality of attention, aimed directly at the camera, Celia with something that was almost a smile, but was more specifically the expression of a person who is entirely satisfied with where they are standing. Below the photograph, on the small shelf Homer had put up, there was a folded piece of paper, the note from Miss Dorrance about James, which Celia had put there, because it seemed like the kind of thing that belonged in that particular spot. And next to it, a smooth piece of limestone from the Crossroads pile, which Homer had picked up on that October drive home from Austin and placed there without ceremony, and which had been there ever since. It was not a large stone. It was not remarkable in itself. But it was from that particular place, and everyone in the family knew what it meant, and James had asked about it when he was 7 and been told the story, and Anna had asked about it when she was 5 and been told the same story with different emphasis, and Thomas would ask about it when he was old enough and would be told it too. The story of the Crossroads, the wagon and the rope and the man on the sorrel horse who stopped. The 2 brothers who rode in from different directions. The woman who had the deed in her boot and the knife she had put there herself. The judge and the warrant and the mesquite tree. The way that the worst thing that had happened had also, in the particular and irreducible logic of a life, led to the best. Not because suffering is ennobling, which it is not always, or because grief makes a person stronger, which it does not always, but because Emmett Shelton had raised a daughter who held on, and because Homer Hale had grown into a man who could not ride past a wrong thing, and because they had both arrived at the same crossroads at the same moment and made the choice to stay. On a Thursday morning in the early spring of 1889, Celia Hale stood on the south porch of her house and looked out at the fields, which were green in a way that the hill country only manages in the first weeks of March before the heat gets serious about itself. And she could hear Homer in the kitchen with Thomas, who was 5 now and deeply involved in Homer's breakfast preparations in the manner of a self-appointed assistant. And she could hear James in the barn with the horses. And she could hear Anna somewhere in the house producing a monologue that was probably addressed to her cat, but contained the word suboptimal at least once. She held her coffee with both hands and breathed the morning air, which smelled of cedar and limestone and new grass, and she thought about her father, which she did every morning in some form, and she thanked him, which she also did every morning in some form, for the land and the bones and the principle that being all right was possible. And then Thomas came through the door and attached himself to her right knee, and told her that Papa had made the eggs wrong again, and Homer followed him out with his own coffee, and the expression of a man who has been told his eggs are wrong by a 5-year-old, and finds this funnier than he should. And Celia laughed and told Thomas that Papa's eggs were fine, and Thomas said they were not fine, and Homer said he would take Thomas's criticism under serious advisement. And the morning unfolded around them exactly as mornings do when the life inside them is the one it is supposed to be. The crossroads still stood 4 miles south, where the old roads met. The mesquite was larger. The limestone pile grew every year, stone by stone, from the hands of people who passed through, and added their piece to the accumulation. the way that communities build the things that matter, not through a single grand gesture, but through the patient, repeated, ordinary act of each person contributing what they could carry. It was a good crossroads. It had been, from the beginning, a place where things were decided. And what had been decided there, in the afternoon light of an October day in 1873, was still standing, and still building itself into everything it was going to be.